right. Let's proceed with the next lecture. So now we are going to get technical. The next two lectures are going to be on the intrinsics and the mechanisms of Bitcoin. So we'll start with the transactions, UTXO, blocks, and block mining. And we'll proceed with the other issues in the next lecture. So Bitcoin transactions. All right, so in this example, you can see three different transactions. Each transaction has inputs and outputs, which are encoded in a certain way, right? And the input to a transaction can only be derived from an output to a previous transaction, which is well known to everyone and which can be verified. So each user possesses a wallet identified by public-private key pairs, and the wallet can also produce such pairs. That's the idea of wallets. Then, suppose there is transaction A which makes a transfer and the output of transaction A is used by transaction C. So transaction C wants to use the previous transfer of transaction A as the input to this transaction. So what does the user of transaction C, the originator of transaction C, do? The user would encrypt transaction C using the private key produced by the wallet. Now, transaction C contains outputs to wallet addresses and in Bitcoin, every transaction must include one output, which is transaction fee. Transaction fee is paid to the miner who includes the transaction in the block. And we are going to talk about transaction fees later today. Now, transaction C must reference unspent transaction output. This is a very important concept in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. To understand UTXOs, unspent transaction outputs, from previous blocks. So for every transaction, there are multiple inputs and multiple outputs. So what does it mean? Suppose I don't have as a user, I don't have a balance. It's not like a bank. Instead, I have a collection of assets. Could be a collection of Bitcoins, could be a collection of NFTs, could be anything. So for financial transactions, like an amount of Bitcoins, as the inputs for my transaction, I can take, for example, certain amount. Okay, so in this example, the output 2 of transaction A is 1 Bitcoin. Output 1 of transaction B is 2 Bitcoins, right? So I take both of them as the input. So the total amount of inputs in transaction C would be 3 Bitcoins. Now, the total amount of inputs must be equal to the total amount of outputs, right? So what does transaction C do? Transfers 2 Bitcoins to Bob, 0.9 to Carol, and 0.1 is a special transaction to pay the fee to whoever is going to mine the block. That's why the address is not specified here to whom it's transferred. Because at this point, when you create the transaction, you don't know which miner is going to include your transaction in the block. So you don't know to whom you are going to transfer the fee. So again, very important that has not been spent already. Otherwise, it's called double spending. And therefore, the system needs to track all the outputs that were previously issued, but that have not been spent yet. Because only those outputs can be used as inputs to new transactions. And once spent, a transactional output cannot be used ever again, because miners verify every transaction. So that's the idea of UTXO, and that's the basic idea of how transactions are structured and laid out in Bitcoin. So if you have any questions about transactions, please ask. Otherwise, we are moving on to wallets. The reference on unspent transaction part, which one? Yeah, so this, and therefore it can be used, therefore it's unspent, it's called UTXO, and therefore it can be used as an input to transaction C, okay? But now, after transaction C has been included in the ledger, everyone would see that this output has already been spent. So it's not a UTXO any longer. It's not an unspent transaction output any longer, right? And then it's impossible to reuse the same output ever again. Okay? So wallets and addresses. So users require a wallet to store money, and that includes any user. And now we can see a bit of a use of cryptography. So wallet is both authenticated and identified by public-private key pairs. Now, wallet can also generate its own key pairs. So many wallets have the ability to generate additional pairs of keys. Why is that? Because, for example, Alice wants to issue many transactions and sign those transactions, and Alice may want to receive funds from tokens from different other users. In that case, so what would be the address of Alice? It's not necessarily a good idea for Alice to reuse the same address all the time. Even though Alice is just one user, one person, Alice has the ability to generate many addresses, and each of them would still belong to Alice. So the wallet of Alice can generate many pairs and many addresses. They're called one-time addresses. So for each incoming transaction, so Bob wants to transfer some amount to Alice, Bob would ask Alice, what's your address to use for this transaction? That would be done out of band. Okay. And then Bob would use this address, but it would be just a one-time address. After that transaction, the same address would never be used again by Alice. Why is it a good idea to generate new addresses all the time? Because because this way, this promotes unlinkability. This way, other users, the ledger is open and readable to anyone. This way, no one would be able to establish that the funds were all coming to the same address and belong to the same person. The pairs are generated using elliptic curve cryptography, as we discussed yesterday. Also, an interesting thing is that the wallets themselves are not part of the Bitcoin infrastructure. Bitcoin doesn't concern itself with how you generate those pairs. It's an added component, which is not standardized in Bitcoin. But of course, there are many solutions. And okay, so many solutions. Of course, you can keep wallet as a local application. You can run it in the cloud. You can have a hardware wallet, the picture of which you can see in the top on the right. Okay. There are also different types of wallet. There is custodial wallet and non-custodial wallet. Custodial wallet means that you trust some third party to manage your keys. Well, that's a bit dangerous, right? Because it requires trust in that third party. And non-custodial wallet means that basically you have full control over the wallet, and whoever provides the wallet, for example, in the cloud, doesn't have access to your information. Okay, it sounds like it's better to trust yourself than someone else. Well, the problem, of course, is that if you lose the key, it's a problem, right? So do you trust yourself to never lose a key? It's not so simple, right? But I'm going to talk about it. Okay, so how do we redeem transactions? Each transactional address, and that's important, each transactional address, so what is an address of Alice? So each transactional address is a hash of the public key of the receiver. So what happens is that the wallet generates a new pair of public-private keys, then takes the public key of the receiver, applies the hash, and that hash becomes the address of the receiver. And the receiver needs to, of course, to sign the proof with the private key in order to redeem the transaction. If Alice is able to sign so after Bob transfers some funds to that address, Alice needs to show to everyone that she owns this address. How would she do that? Well, she is able to sign that address with the private key, and everyone else would be able to use the Alice public key to see that indeed that's the correct address. One interesting thing is that transactions in Bitcoin do not have the from address. So no one is able to know who exactly sent the funds. Well, that's not exactly true, because everyone knows that the funds correspond to basically the funds correspond to some previous UTXO, right? So it might be possible to track it. And even though there is no from field in the header of the transaction, there is still the signature. So if you manage somehow to track the signature, then you might be able to establish. And so you might be able to prove that you are actually the sender of the funds, because only you can produce the signature. But that's not as simple as just to see the address of the sender. So it requires some procedure. And as mentioned, each address is designed to be single use. Now the fun part, what happens if you lose the private key? So loss of private key means that the wallet and its funds are permanently locked, as it's no longer possible to sign proofs redeeming existing TXOs. Since Alice is not able to produce signatures any longer, well, it means that everything that was transferred to the wallet in the past is no longer accessible. So you can say poor Alice, of course, but it's not bad for, it's not only bad for Alice, it's actually bad for the entire system. Why so? Because the money is lost, and thereby the total amount of currency in circulation in Bitcoin is also reduced. And Bitcoin wants to regulate the total amount of currency. And of course, if everyone starts losing funds, then it's a problem for Bitcoin as a system, not just for Alice. So trusting an online service to store your keys is also risky, since there is no way to prove that you are the rightful owner if the key is stolen or misused. There is no, apart from the keys, there is no other mechanism. So, for example, okay, one problem, of course, is the third party itself steals the keys from you. But another problem is if the third party is hacked and someone else stole the key and uses the key to redeem your transaction. That's it. There is no way for you to restore the funds. So yes, it's a big problem. And in practice, probably what's generally considered the most reliable solution is to store your private key on tamper-proof hardware wallets, such as this one. So, and of course, like you need to be careful with how you handle the wallet. So, how you where you store it in your house, right? And of course, that there have been some cases of physical abuse when it comes to the wallet. So it's not like 100% proof, but still it's considered an overall safer solution. Yeah, I can tell you a couple of just interesting stories about losing the key. So there was a famous case, like I believe in the UK, when a person bought a lot of a lot of bitcoins when in 2009, when it was still very cheap. And today, like the total amount would be over $100 million. What was the problem? However, he was replacing his computer, and accidentally, well, apparently he was a rich person, so maybe he wasn't involved in all detail. Apparently, he stored all the keys on the hard disk, and then the whole computer went to some dump, right? And since then, the person dedicated his life to wading through municipal garbage dumps and trying to search for the disk. He even offered to the $20 million to the municipality in order to help him to recover the disk. But so far, like his lifetime search is still continuing. I mean, the other story a bit closer to home is that I had a student, his hard disk got corrupted, right? And he was very sad. So I was compassionate because I thought he lost all the research results together with producing. But it turned out that he stored some keys there. All right. Let's talk a bit about the blocks. So far, we've talked about transactions and wallets. Let's talk about blocks in Bitcoin. So what does a block contain? So here you can see the chain of blocks, nothing new here. But let's consider the structure of a block. What does it include? As mentioned, each block consists of two parts, block header and block body. Block header includes some control fields, while block body includes transactions. So in the header, you will have several fields. Not all of them are depicted here. These are just maybe some of the most important ones, but there are more fields like the magic number, the version number, and so on. I'm not presenting all the fields in the header, just perhaps the interesting ones. As mentioned, there is a pointer to the previous block for the sake of immutability. Additionally, there is a timestamp when the block is produced. So you cannot produce, for example, if you send a block, propose a block with timestamp, well, in the past, the block would not be accepted. Actually, timestamp is not so simple because the clocks on different computers can be a bit out of sync. Your time, the time on your computer is not the time on my computer. So how can I verify? So suppose I receive a block with the time which is a bit in the past. Okay, should I accept it or not? Well, okay, so usually it's out of sync up to maybe a minute. But if you allow the blocks to be out of sync, say for 5 minutes, it's usually not a problem. But anyway, it's also a challenge and not a trivial one. Nonce is something related to proof of work, and we are going to talk about nonce and proof of work a lot today. So I'm not going to explain it in this slide. You'll have to wait for a few slides. Now, transaction root is a very important part. So, as mentioned, this is the header, and this is the block body. And here we have all transactions included. But we organize transaction as a tree. It's called a cryptographic Merkle tree. And then we hashes. I'm going to talk about Merkle tree in detail today in the next lecture. But the idea is that we compute hashes throughout the and then we compute the root hash, and the root hash is included in the header. So the body only includes the transactions themselves. It doesn't even include the intermediate hashes. The intermediate hashes are only needed in this case for the computation of the root. So we have a list of transactions in the body, and the tree of the Merkle tree included in the header. So I can already say that one of the purpose of the root is for verification. Again, it's like a CRC to verify that the transaction included in the not be perfect. So those are perhaps the most important fields in the header. Next, we are going to talk about communication in Bitcoin, the communication layer. So in Bitcoin, the idea is relatively the primitives of communication are relatively simple. We just broadcast information to the entire network. Okay, what kind of information? New transactions, so clients who produce new transactions. And when there are transactions included in blocks, they broadcast new transaction to the entire network. Miners who manage to solve crypto puzzle and who propose new blocks, they broadcast those blocks to update the blockchain. So in both cases, it's the same broadcast primitive which is used. Now, how is this broadcast primitive implemented? It's implementing using what's called a gossiping protocol in a peer-to-peer network. So how does it work? I'm not going into the detail, just the overview. So first of all, there is like broadcast protocol. It's through gossiping. So every node in the network has a few neighbors, and every node selects a subset of neighbors to which it would send the new information. And when another node receives the information, it would also select a subset of neighbors to which it would send the information. And this is how it propagates. So of course, it's important how you select that subset. So there are a lot of details, but I'm not going into those details. There is also another element of the communication protocol. The broadcast is not always 100% reliable, so it's not a guarantee that the information would reach all the nodes. It would normally reach a large percent of the node, but not necessarily all the nodes. Okay, so how would the nodes who missed the information, how would they retrieve it later? So what happens is what's called the anti-entropy protocol, in which I exchange information with my neighbors. I'm telling them what I know. I produce a bitmap of information that I own. I don't send all the information that I have. Instead, I produce like a digest, a bitmap of the information that I have. And then like I exchange it with the neighbors, and the neighbor sends it to me, and we compare what the neighbors has and what I have, right? So this way I can say, okay, I'm missing this transaction, and the neighbor can see, oh, I'm missing the new block. Okay, so now we can help each other, or we can retrieve, we can ask to send the specific information which is missing. So the protocol, the gossiping protocol used for the broadcast in Bitcoin is not terribly efficient, but the thing that is, it has not been a bottleneck so far. So why is that? Because it takes an order of 10 minutes on average to create new blocks, to solve crypto puzzles, to perform other operations, and on average it takes much less than a minute to propagate the information. So 1 minute compared to 10 minutes. So yes, we could optimize it better, but compared to 10 minutes, it would not be a great improvement. So, despite the inefficiency, the protocol works also well because financial transactions, the transfers are very short. It's like, a typical transaction in Bitcoin would be less than 1 kilobyte, not megabyte. And also, the transaction in Bitcoin is far below that of credit cards, as we'll see. So, the implementation of the broadcast needs to be fairly reliable for the system to work, but 100% reliability in message delivery is not guaranteed. And message propagation should be reasonably fast compared to the time to produce blocks. Why is that? Why is it so important? Well, of course, you'll be able to get quicker confirmations for inclusion of transactions. But also, slower network quantifiably increases the risk of attacks. So there have been some attacks on the network in Bitcoin. That's why it needs to be reasonably fast. But even an order of half a minute is still okay compared to 10 minutes. So this is just a very brief overview of the communication. Now, let's talk about the transaction flow. Suppose Alice wants to send some funds to Bob. What happens is that Bob generates and sends a public key address. Alice creates a transaction using this address. Alice signs the transaction and sends it to the network. So the transaction is broadcast using gossiping. Now, finally, some miner would decide to include the transaction in a block and propose the block, and the block would be appended to the chain, at which point Bob can verify that the transaction is in the ledger, and at this point, it becomes part of the UTXO, and from this point on, Bob can sign new transactions which would redeem this address. Okay? Now we start a relatively big topic, which is consensus in Bitcoin. How do we reach it? Okay, so consensus is about agreement. What do we need to agree on? We need to agree on two things. First, which recently broadcast transaction would go into the blockchain, but also in what order. The order is also important. Imagine you have double spending, so someone tries to use the same funds, so it's not possible in the real world. If I have like if I have a bill of 100 rupees, I would not be able to spend it twice. In the virtual world, however, I can send two different transactions. I can create two different transactions, which will try to spend the same UTXO. That's not a legal thing, of course, but I can try to do it, and there are many attacks related to that. Okay, so in that case, if it happens, it's very important to know which of the two or multiple double spending transactions is the first one, because the first one will be legal and the second one will be illegal. So the order is important. All right, so how do we reach consensus? The general anatomy of consensus, of all consensus solutions, is like this. Someone needs to make a proposal, everyone needs to reach a consensus, and then, of course, the decision needs also to be announced and needs to reach everyone. The problem, however, is that reaching a consensus is a tough problem. Especially in an uncontrolled environment without any entity controlling the outcome. And there are dozens of impossibility results since 1983. It doesn't scale well beyond order of 30 participants, right? And it takes a long time to converge. So everyone would converge to the same decision. So that's not a good news, right? And yet, so I would say that Bitcoin was the first practical system that manages to reach consensus on a large scale. So let's see how it does it. So the first challenge is who proposes new blocks and when? And that's the critical part. The network cannot sustain. Consensus protocols are fragile. They are not scalable. So the network cannot sustain each and every user of the system making a proposal whenever the user wants. We need to moderate it. We need to make sure that the rate of proposals, we need to moderate both the number of proposals and the rate of concurrent proposals. The problem is made worse by the proliferation of identities, Sybil attacks. Because now, one user, so again, it's not possible in the real world, but in the virtual world, I can create multiple identities of myself, and now 10 different Romans, well, no one would know that it's Romans, right? 10 different miners, 10 different proposers would suddenly, each one propose a block. Okay? That's a Sybil attack. When one entity replicates itself or creates multiple identities for itself. So that exacerbates the problem of scalability or moderation in blockchain. So again, we need to moderate both the number of proposals and the rate of concurrent proposals. And we need to do it. Programmatically as a mechanism. There is no organizational entity or censorship. So it's all done by mechanisms. On the other hand, we need to keep both sufficiently high. Because the easiest way to moderate the rate is to say no proposals. Well, that's not a good system, right? So if we want to make progress. We want to sufficiently high transaction rate. So we need sufficiently high number of proposals, but we do not want the number of proposals to be too high. So we need different mechanisms. One mechanism to bring it down, one mechanism to bring it up. And Bitcoin includes both mechanisms. Okay, so let's start from the question of how we keep the number of proposals and the rate of concurrent proposals down. There are several principal solutions. I'm going to talk about them today. But Bitcoin uses proof of work. What is proof of work? In proof of work, a miner, a block proposer, needs to do some heavy computation and show a proof of the heavy computation. And whoever manages to do the computation first would gain the right to propose a block. Well, everyone would gain a right, but of course, whoever proposes the blocks later, the block would not be accepted. Okay. So there are additional optimizations to improve the scalability. For example, why do we do blocks? Why don't we do consensus for each transaction separately? Can someone tell me why do we want to have blocks? In principle, we don't have to. We could have we could run consensus for each transaction. Why would it not be a good idea? Why do we want to include multiple transactions in a block? Of course. Scalability. Again, it's scalability. So if suppose we have 100 transactions, and if we want to run consensus for each, and then we will have 100 times more block proposals or transaction proposals or consensus instances compared to the case when we combine all 100 in a single block, and then we just run consensus once. Much more scalable. So a block in Bitcoin is, as we saw, structured as a tree of proposed transactions with nice cryptographic properties, but we'll talk about it later. Okay, so let's talk about the crypto puzzles in Bitcoin. We said that in order to gain the right to propose a block, a miner needs to do some hard computation and show a proof of it. What's the mechanism? The mechanism is called proof of work. In Bitcoin, it's implemented by crypto puzzles. So in crypto puzzles, the proposal needs to find some nonce, which is a fixed size number, such that the hash of the block is included. And again, like the block consists of a header and a body, right? That's a block. So what we want is to find such a number to put here in the header that the hash of the block would be within certain numerical range. Specifically, it would be smaller than a target value. It would be sufficiently small. And there is theoretical proof that there is no good way to find such nonce. What we effectively need to do is to scan the entire nonce space one by one. Okay, we can choose the order in which we scan the space of candidate values. But that doesn't help. We cannot even know which region of the space would be more likely. As a matter of fact, in crypto puzzles, each point in the space of candidate values has the same probability to be a good solution. So we simply linearly scan values one by one, and that's the best we can do. So what is a target? Target is a fraction of the hash space. And if we make the target smaller, it would be more difficult to find successful solutions to crypto puzzles. If we made the target bigger, it would be easier. Another interesting aspect of Bitcoin is that Bitcoin itself regulates the target. How does it do it? Every node computes the target every certain number of blocks. So that allows for synchronization because all nodes know the target for a given block. They all in agreement about the value of the target. Okay, so we compute how? Such the average time for the whole network to solve a crypto puzzle is 10 minutes. What happens is that the system profiles its performance. Everyone would look at how long it takes to produce blocks. If blocks are produced too fast, then the system would make the target smaller. So it would become harder to produce block. If the system is too slow in producing block, it would make the target larger. In such a way that on average, it takes for the whole network 10 minutes to solve it. That means if you take a particular miner processor, then the mean time to next block would be 10 minutes divided by the fraction of piece computing power to the total computing power in the network, right? And another important part is that the solution is fast to verify. So how do we verify that it's a good nonce? You just compute one hash. Very cheap. One hash computation. But in order to find the solution, you need to explore this like a very large space of potential values. And this is where the hardness is coming from. So this is an illustration. Yeah. So here you can see a ledger including 3 blocks. And now the block number 3 is being formed, right? So each miner listens to incoming transaction which the miner receives for the broadcast, right? And maintains for the mempool pending transactions. Pending meaning that need to be included in blocks, but that have not been included in blocks yet. So that's mempool. And but essentially it's a loop, which we'll see. All the time, the miner will try to form a block out of the transaction in the mempool, and then we'll try to explore different nonce values such that the hash starts with sufficient number of zeros is the same as to say that it's sufficiently small. And only when the successfully finds the nonce value, only then it would declare it as a solution, would attach the solved block to the chain and would propagate the block by using broadcast to the entire network, right? If someone else beats the miner to it, then the miner would update the pending pool of transactions, right? Would remove transactions from that pending pool, would try to form a new block which would already be block number 4 on top of block number 3. That's another illustration of the cycle of POW of Bitcoin. So there are 3 processes here which are happening in parallel. 3 processes. One process is that new transactions are coming all the time. And they're entering the mempool. And then from the mempool, they're being added to the block being proposed, right, being formed. So at any point, like before you solve the crypto puzzle, at any point you can add new transactions to the block. That's one process. The second process is difficulty adjustment. Okay, that doesn't happen very often. It happens on 2,000-something blocks, right? Okay, when it happens, the difficulty is being updated. And then the main process is this loop, right? The miner would select a new hash, starts from here, then would include the select a new nonce, would put the nonce value in the block, would compute the hash, would compare the hash to the target. Yes, is declared as a winner. No, it goes back to the non-selection. And the loop continues and continues. So the 3 things happen in parallel. This is how POW works. Now, well, you could ask, you could ask a couple of questions. One question, are you even guaranteed to find the solution in the nonce space? The answer is no. There could be no solution at all. What happens in terms of probability, every point in the nonce space has the same probability to be a solution. But it doesn't guarantee that collectively, collectively the nonce space may include many solutions or 0. It's all probabilistic. The second question you can ask here is, suppose I started this loop, right? I already have a significant fraction of the nonce space. I have not found a solution yet. At this point, new transactions come. Is it a good idea for me to add new transactions to the block and alter the block? Because maybe if I do that, maybe that would change the nonce space. I would need to change the nonces again. So maybe it's a bad idea for me to put in new transactions. The answer is no. And that's the beauty of how it's done in Bitcoin. And the reason why it's okay for me to add new transactions is, again, probability distribution. So regardless of the mining process is memoryless, the probability for a point in the non-space to be a solution doesn't change as I explore solutions. Suppose the non-space includes like 10 points. I explored 5. Does it affect the probability for point number 6 to be a solution? No. It's a memoryless process. And because of this, if I add new transactions, it's still the same probability. The probability is not affected, and therefore, the miners are incentivized to add transactions as they mine. So that's an important property. So, okay, that was the challenge of keeping the transaction rate down. And now what's we had the second challenge. How to keep them up? And why would the miner propose non-empty blocks? In order to incentivize miners to propose blocks and to include transactions, we have two incentive-related mechanisms in Bitcoin. The first mechanism is called block creation reward, and a block proposal creates a number of new Bitcoins and transfers them to the proposer. It's called the coin-based transaction in Bitcoin. So it's included as a separate transaction in the block. And by the way, it ensures that each proposer solves a different safety puzzle because every miner would put a different coin-based transaction in its block. It's the only way in which new Bitcoins are created and added to circulation. And the amount is predefined, so the proposer cannot decide how much it would get. The amount is fixed, and it gets halved every 210,000 of blocks. So you can see that it's a geometric progression. And it's predicted to go down to 0 before year 2140, but of course it's far in the future. Who knows what will happen by then? The geometric progression totals to 21 million Bitcoins. So that would be the maximum amount of Bitcoins in circulation, minus all the Bitcoins that were lost due to lost keys. However, there is a catch. The catch is that the Bitcoin reserved the right to change all the rules in the future. The same consensus mechanism is good not only for proposing new blocks. The same consensus mechanism can also be used for voting on new blocks. For voting on new rules. So instead of geometric progression, the Bitcoin can suddenly decide to do something else. If everyone agrees to switch the rules, that's good. The second incentive mechanism is called transaction inclusion fee, in which Alice can decide to pay a small fee to the block creator as part of her transaction. This is very different from block creation reward. It's voluntary. There is no fixed and predefined amount. It's at the discretion of Alice. Alice decides. Now, of course, if Alice decides to put a very small amount, maybe miner would not like it, and maybe miner would not include Alice transactions. So Alice has a certain risk here. And generally speaking, the miners would prioritize transactions with higher fees, right? So due to those incentives, miners do want to propose blocks. Due to POW, they don't propose too many blocks. So by the way, there is a common misconception that POW is the consensus mechanism in Bitcoin. That's not exactly true. POW is not how we reach consensus. POW is the mechanism protecting consensus. So the two incentives create what's called the crypto economy of mining. They give rise to the mining industry in Bitcoin. The miners, this is what they do. They are cracking crypto puzzles and listening to transaction broadcasts. So there is a dedicated rig. They should do that. Okay, so is it profitable? Well, there are quite a few miners, so apparently yes. But what can we say about this crypto economy of mining? There are expenses. The expenses would be to buy the mining rig, and there are operational costs like electricity, cooling, and repairs. The expenses are paid in real currency, while operating costs are variable. On the other hand, profits. So what are the profits? Block creation reward and transaction fee times the number of transactions in block. So the profits are paid in Bitcoins. So how profitable it is depends on the number of, depends on the ratio between the real currency and Bitcoins. However, the fee and rate of transactions are unpredictable. And while the mean time to next blocks is easy to compute, the per miner sample is small, while variations are huge. So you're a miner, you have a mining rig. You can be lucky and find the jackpot next day, or you can spend all your life, 100 years, without finding anything. So there is this unpredictability. And therefore, because of this unpredictability, there is a concept of mining pools. It's a group, what is a mining pool? It's a group of cooperating miners. If one miner in the mining pool finds the solution, the miner would need to share the profits with everyone within the pool. Okay, so it means that the jackpot becomes smaller, but because of the size of the mining pool, you're also more likely to hit it. So it becomes more predictable. The winnings are smaller, but more predictable. And usually people say it's a good trade. I suggest that we stop the lecture here and continue the next hour.